Howdy, folks. You are here with Jacob Skepis. That's me, for those of you who don't know. And Martin Rafalo, my colleague at JPS. And we're here today to discuss the current debate that has been taking over the evidence-based community between Mike Israetel and Eric Helms in the online sort of fitness world about mesocycle progression for hypertrophy. And I was very fortunate to be a part of a response letter to the editor where we critiqued the original letter to the editor written by Mike and his colleagues, where they outlined their approach or ideas for how best to progress a mesocycle for hypertrophy. And Brian, Eric, and I had some critiques that we wrote a letter to the editor in response to their paper. And there's been a lot of sort of back and forth on the Revive Stronger channel and in further discussions online since those papers were published. And in this sort of video, we're going to give you guys our thoughts, as well as talk about some of the important things that we have realized haven't been discussed or have been left out of some of the conversation. Because obviously Eric and Mike are having debates about very, very nuanced and sort of high level areas, and there's a lot of things that are beneath that which are very important to understand, which we feel need to be addressed. So before we get into things, Martin, tell us a little bit about yourself. People aren't going to know who you are because you're not as big and famous as I am on Instagram, so just give everyone a heads up.
On Instagram, huh? Okay. Give me a few years. That's it. So I have been working in the fitness industry now for a long time, since I was actually 16. A personal trainer though for probably 6 years, and I have just recently completed a master's in applied sports science. So I've always been interested in the scientific side of things when it comes to training and nutrition, and that is what spurred me on to do my master's. And I'm hoping now to transition into a PhD and investigate certain aspects of the scientific literature that at the moment probably aren't very well researched, and hopefully allow the broader fitness community to be, I guess, exposed to the more nuance. And a particular area that I'm interested in is like failure training for trained individuals, whether or not we need to be training to failure, and also how we can kind of utilize failure training as part of a mesocycle, and that is then integrated into mesocycle progression, which is what we're going to be speaking about today. And as we know, there isn't much research, or probably no research at all, on mesocycle progression itself, especially as it pertains to like volume, intensity, train to failure, whatever it is. So that's definitely an area of interest, which I hope to dive a little deeper into next year. And like I said, provide some more knowledge surrounding those areas, because there are gaps in science, and I'm hoping to help fill some of these gaps over the coming years. And definitely looking forward to this discussion. Like Jacob outlined, there were a few things that were left out of these debates, and I guess that's the nature of these debates. Like Jacob said, ideas are being thrown back and forth, and there's really not much time to dive deep into certain topics and provide more context. So I've heard some people say that there weren't many clear-cut conclusions and not many practical takeaways. But like I said, that's kind of the nature of these debates, where ideas are tossed back and forth. But that's what allows that is what allows ideas to flourish. And really, as a listener, if you are listening to these debates, you should try to integrate those ideas into your own, programming methodologies. You probably shouldn't try and overhaul your own programming, and, you probably shouldn't take one side or the other. Try and utilize those ideas and integrate them into your own methods. And hopefully today we can provide some more context surrounding the topic of mesocycle progression and help, the listeners, the audience, further integrate all these, ideas into their own programming. So yeah, definitely looking forward to taking things a bit further now.
Yeah, so we have spoken about this at length on the gym floor, which is what we do at JPS. We're sort of very fortunate to have the opportunity to train with one another, and chew the fat about these things in person, which is very different to what most other fitness professionals are dealing with, because usually if you're self-employed as a fitness professional, you're on your own, or you might be working in a facility that's not necessarily up to speed with these kind of things, or doesn't have an interest in them, or you're a researcher and you don't necessarily have many colleagues who are in the same sort of area, or it's very biased in that regard towards research, versus JPS, where we are lucky to have you, Martin, in the research, in the academic field, as well as coaching. And I'm obviously trying my best to sort of bridge the gap between the research and practice, but we offer quite a unique perspective, I think, in that we're in the trenches trying to implement what we know and learn from the research, to get the best results for our clients. So I think what we have discussed previously is going to be beneficial, and I think it will offer a unique perspective to what people have previously read or heard. So first, we agree that we should start this discussion with the points I made on an Instagram post that related to the certainty and probability that we have in a lot of the, I guess, the knowledge or the information that we get in research, and how a lot of that's built on assumptions, and some assumptions have stronger, certainty and evidential weight than others, and that's really important. So I'm just going to briefly talk about those things now before we get into things. But yeah, I guess what we want you guys to remember is that the topic of mesocycle progression and exercise science in general operates within an applied science, and that means that there's a lot of predictions about complex systems, namely the human body, and these complex systems operating in the natural world, where there's a lot of changes in environments, and these systems are also influenced by a social component. So there's a lot of moving parts. So when we have any research and we try to extrapolate that and apply it in practice, there's a lot of unknown. Really, there is a lot of unknown, and even with sophisticated knowledge of fitness fatigue dynamics, hypertrophy, RPE, injury risk literature, and all these sorts of things, this entire discussion, especially the areas which we do have a lot less certainty about, such as mesocycle progression for hypertrophy, all predicated upon probabilities. And in my Instagram post, I had an image of myself that was pixelated and slightly blurry, and it kind of looked like a jigsaw puzzle. And if you're following on Instagram, you'll be able to see that. But the point of that was to highlight that the pixels are blurry and didn't fit that well together. And even though each pixel was like imperfect, you could still make out the image and the shape. And that's akin to the information we get from the research. It has some uncertainty. And when we have enough pieces of imperfect information and we put them together, we can get an idea of what the overall picture is trying to tell us. And these are what we can call tangible uncertainties, which are known unknowns. And they are the bits of our puzzle at the limits of our reasoning or modeling. And that's essentially what we're doing in this discussion about mesocycle progression. We're drawing a lot of conclusions from these imperfect pieces of information, and we're trying to fit it all together. So there's a lot of uncertainties that we can't necessarily quantify or even identify sometimes, and that's science. Science and information from science is never completely, unequivocally certain. And any attempts to understand these complex systems or make predictions about what's going to work better, whether it's Mike or Eric's model, about hypertrophy and the outcomes we see in training, come with uncertainty. So I guess before we get into things, we just want you guys to know that we do not, should not, and can't draw conclusions from a single piece of evidence. And a lot of the points that these guys and myself included have made, is always based on a single piece of evidence. Like at some point there is one study that found something, and then you have more and more studies that find the same thing or point in that direction, and so on and so forth. So just remember that we do have a lot of uncertainties and assumptions that we're building our understanding of this mesocycle progression upon, and the strength of those assumptions and how certain we are in them will determine how strong those foundations are, because they are the foundations of our beliefs and justifications for things. So with that out of the way, let's talk, Martin, about some of the points made in the current debate. And when we talk about that, we need to, discuss and outline, what the hypertrophy stimulus is, because we're trying to progress the stimulus to achieve hypertrophy. So I know this is an area that you're very much across. So do you want to discuss what the primary mechanism and stimulus in training is for muscle growth before we get into the exact debate?
Yeah, I think it's really important to cover the foundation of some of these key concepts, like the stimulus for hypertrophy, and other things which we'll discuss soon, like progressive overload. Like most people understand what these things are on a superficial level, but I think diving a little bit deeper can definitely help listeners grasp more practical takeaways from these debates and these discussions. I think having this understanding will help you make sense of mesocycle progression a little more. So yeah, the stimulus for hypertrophy, I guess we could quite simply say, is mechanical tension, but it's also not just that simple. So mechanical tension can be broken down into two main components. One component being the magnitude of that tension, and the other component being the exposure. Okay, now I'm not going to elaborate on what mechanical tension is, because I think most of the listeners would have an understanding of that. But what I want to do is kind of elucidate how the magnitude and the exposure can be utilized to progress the stimulus throughout a mesocycle, and how that is dependent on certain things like the exercise, for example. So anyway, if we look at the magnitude first, what we can say is that there are two main aspects that will influence the magnitude of the tension that you acquire in, let's say, one specific set. One being fiber activation, and the other being the force velocity relationship, which again, not sure if the listeners are familiar with that, but using these two kind of aspects, what we can take away from that is that, okay, well, your exercise execution is going to influence how fibers are activated. So we need to be executing exercises appropriately, and that's probably an assumption we're going to make throughout this discussions, that exercises will be executed optimally for hypertrophy. We kind of need to set that, because we're trying to isolate.
Optimally, just let's break that down, because we want this to be practical. So optimally will be full range of motion.
Yep.
Right. Would also be standardized technique from rep to rep to rep.
Yep.
Minimal inertia and momentum that's assisting in the movement, as well as the target muscle group performing as much work as it should, without sort of other non-targeted muscle groups sort of contributing.
Yes, correct. So there's definitely a few factors that would influence execution, as you outlined, Jacob. And like I said, I think we kind of need to set that, because we're trying to isolate volume and intensity here and work out which one we should progress throughout a mesocycle. So that's that. But then what will also influence fiber activation and the amount of force that a muscle feels throughout a set is the intensity of effort. Okay, so effort throughout a set, and that was, I guess, a factor that Eric and Brian were discussing in the debate. They mentioned that if we don't really need to be progressing volume week to week, but we can progress intensity of effort, and the reason that is the case is because that increases the magnitude of tension, that one component. Now, if we look at the exposure, so the other side, well, that is really going to be influenced by total volume. And what I'm referring to here, though, is particularly so set volume. So really, the more sets you do, the more exposure to tension you are going to experience. Now, okay, you might say, oh, what if I do an extra set and it's only 1 rep? Is that enough exposure? Well, probably not. But remember, the context of this discussion is hypertrophy. So when I say, we're doing an extra set, well, I mean a set that is within a range that is going to be sufficient to stimulate optimal hypertrophy. So we know that 1 rep, yes, a single, maximal rep can elicit some hypertrophy, but by no means is it probably going to be optimal. So, what we can say is, within that 5 to 15-ish repetition range, that's where you're probably going to get the best mechanical tension stimulus. Beyond that, yes, you definitely can. 15 to 30 reps will also give you a good tension stimulus. But what we also need to understand there is that we also get a lot of metabolic activity, and there can be some limitations to that. There can also be some upsides to that as well. And then, below that 5 repetition mark, yes, we do get tension again, but we also get a lot of neurological activity, which does come again with some limitation. So when I say, we're doing an extra set to kind of increase the exposure of the tension, I'm referring to, that 5 to 15-ish rep range. So when we set, the exposure and the magnitude, we then realize that, okay, so when we're adding sets on a weekly basis, we're pushing that exposure to the tension up. Okay, that's influencing the main stimulus, which is mechanical tension. But we can also do that. We can also influence that main stimulus by increasing the magnitude of tension. And the best way to do that, probably the most efficient way to do that, is to increase the effort of your sets. Okay, and you can do that by keeping repetitions the same and adding load. Okay, or you can just continue adding reps at a specific load. That's probably going to take you closer to that failure point. And intensity of effort here, what I'm describing is your proximity to failure. Okay, as we get closer to failure, generally, and there are some caveats to this, which we may discuss later, the amount of tension that muscles experience will go up. There are caveats, which, like I said, we can discuss. But those are the two components of that primary stimulus, which we can use to progress the stimulus over the course of a mesocycle. And it's important we progress the stimulus because, what we kind of need to understand here is that there's a difference between just a stimulus itself and an adequate stimulus for growth. Okay, so for example, you could do 10 reps with 5 kilos. You do a bicep curl, 10 reps, 5 kilos. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be an adequate stimulus for growth if you're capable of doing a lot more, and if you're not very close to that failure point, which is what we really need for hypertrophy. So really, that optimal stimulus that we're looking to achieve changes over time as we adapt to prior stimuli. So there needs to be some form of progressing this stimulus so that we can maintain ourselves within that optimal stimulus range as the mesocycle progresses. And I think another important consideration that we should kind of set here is that the stimulus itself is not performance sensitive per se. So increases in performance are not necessary nor sufficient for hypertrophy. So what this means is that you don't need to see increases in performance for hypertrophy to be occurring. And just because there is an increase in performance, it doesn't mean that hypertrophy has occurred. So I think that's an important piece of knowledge for someone who is kind of programming for hypertrophy, because if you are under the impression that each week, your performance needs to be going up for hypertrophy to be occurring, well, I think you're going to be likely to start forcing progression at certain points, just because of this, link that you have in your head between performance and hypertrophy. So I think we need to kind of set that as well. And performance should really be seen as like the byproduct of progressive overload. I mentioned earlier, we need to be progressing that stimulus, right? And the byproduct of that will be these increases in performance, which we see throughout a mesocycle. So just something to keep in mind there as we start to kind of take steps forward towards discussing what progressive overload is, which Jacob can touch on in a second. But what I'm trying to get at here is that, to kind of sum all that up, is that this primary stimulus is mechanical tension. That's what we're aiming to progress, but we can do that by either progressing the magnitude or progressing the exposure. Mike's approach of adding sets primarily on a weekly basis is an approach that is, pushing the exposure to this tension up weekly. And on the other hand, we have an approach that, somewhat maintains exposure, but then drives the magnitude up. So both approaches are essentially still meeting that goal that we have here of progressing the primary stimulus, but just in different ways. And I think it's important to understand that. And I think, what we will discuss later is when or how, these two different components can be, I guess, better suited to specific exercises, specific points throughout a mesocycle, and other considerations. There is context dependency here, and there are any other considerations that I think we can put into place to help people understand, when is the best time to increase exposure, or when is the best time to increase the magnitude to the tension. Because I don't think it's just as simple as, taking one route over the other. I think there are more strategic ways of utilizing this knowledge when we are programming for hypertrophy. So yeah, that is the stimulus for hypertrophy. Now, maybe Jacob, we can touch on how we can kind of integrate that with like progressive overload itself, and take things a bit further from here.
Yeah. So a couple of things to just add to that quickly is that yes, we can increase exposure whilst holding the magnitude constant. So for example, if we hold an RAR of 2, so 2 reps away from failure, and we add sets, for example, we're increasing exposure. But we can also maintain exposure and increase the magnitude, which was what Martin referred to as well, by just getting closer to failure. But you could also have a more reactive approach, which is what we sort of detailed in our response letter to the editor, where you set your exposure, your volume, at what you think is the most optimal or adaptive range, and you then set the magnitude at what you think is going to maximize growth as well, and you keep it there, auto-regulating up and down based on a recovery and performance. And we can get to that in a minute. But basically, if we look to adding sets, which is increasing the exposure, what we see in the literature is this inverted U dose response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, where if you add more sets, you get more growth up until a point where you start getting, plateau, then regression. So, and that's where Mike Israetel, has coined the concept, the MRV, and he has his volume landmarks where you basically work from maintenance volumes, which is the amount of stimulus in an exposure sense that will preserve your current level of muscle mass, and then adding any more volume from there, you move to your minimum effective volume where you get a little bit of growth, but then you get to the maximum adaptive volume where you get the most growth, within your recovery demands, and then you get to a point where you can no longer add volume or recover. So they're the concepts that he used to then predicate his model of set volume progression, because he's working from MEV up to MRV, and he's utilizing the research, or drawing on the research that shows this dose response relationship to be the basis for that model. And then if we look at the magnitude of the stimulus, which is the, again, absolute loading and proximity to failure, we see if we take a set of 10 repetition max, the stimulus will slowly increase and then continue to increase from about 5 reps, and then get higher and higher till about 8 or so reps. And then, the 9th and 10th rep, if you're taking this set to failure, you're not really going to see as much, increase in the stimulus, but fatigue sort of rises exponentially as you get to failure. So we know that training within around 5 reps from failure is going to get sort of the most stimulus for growth from a magnitude sense. And there's also, some important things to consider. Greg Nuckols wrote a great article, or an addendum to his critique of the effective reps model, where he was showcasing that advanced lifters get more growth training further from failure than beginners. and that there is potentially some differences in exercise selection that influence the magnitude of stimulus. So exercises that have the most difficult portion in the stretch, you don't need to train as close to failure to get the same, good stimulus, basically. So there's some considerations there, but in any case, we should touch on the fact that adding sets, we get more exposure to the stimulus, provided we meet intensity thresholds. So within 5 reps from failure. And if we increase the magnitude of stimulus, we're also going to, and train closer and closer to failure. We're getting more of that tension, but we also get more fatigue. And in both cases, we get more fatigue. And that's where the inextricable relationship between volume and hypertrophy is important, because if you increase volume and you're increasing intensity, you're very quickly going to impact your recovery. Your recovery won't return to baseline as quickly. You'll see decrements in performance and be overreaching, which is hitting your MRV. So I think we've sort of covered the foundations of that, and I think for the most part, listeners will hopefully have an idea of where we're at in terms of this discussion and some of the background concepts they need to arm them with where we go moving forward. But we also talked about some important definitions, Martin, when we get into this topic of progression that we feel are very much necessary, because they will help us all get on the same page. And I had a conversation with Brian, and he was very much in agreement that these definitions are important. So let's outline those. So first, we have overload, which is the range in which an imposed stimulus elicits desired adaptations, right? So if you're not training within a certain range of like intensity and volume, whatever you're doing is not going to be overloading, and you're not going to get any growth. We also have progressive overload, which is an increase in the stimulus as a result of adaptations from prior workouts, which is a necessary principle in order for you to maintain that overload threshold over time. So basically, as you train, you get better, and you need to train better. So if your training isn't getting better over time, it's going to fall below that overload threshold, and you won't get adaptations. We then also have 2 important, I guess, definitions that we'll use in this discussion, which are progression and progress. Because progression is an increase in the variables which increase the stimulus. So if we're adding sets or getting closer to failure, we're progressing, right? Variables which increase the stimulus. And this can be done independent of changes in fitness capacity. So somebody's ability to do work or their performance. And then we have progress, which is actual improvement and increases in your fitness abilities with or without an increase in performance, which is independent of the stimulus. So you can get better, without necessarily progressing the stimulus if it's within that adaptive range. So you can make training harder, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get more fitness. You're going to get fitter. So there's some important definitions. Anything you want to add to that or discuss before we really crack into this?
Yeah, I think, the term fitness, I'm not sure if all the listeners would be kind of up to date with what we're kind of referring to in this discussion, because I know it can be used quite diversely. And in this discussion, when we're talking about hypertrophy, so I guess when we say, there's been an increase in fitness, we are referring to, adaptations that pertain to like muscle mass, so morphological adaptations. So we're actually experiencing this increase in muscle mass, which may also be associated with like an increase in force generated capacity, which would then allow you to move more weight as well. So those are the adaptations that we are after, I guess, based on this discussion and what we are referring to if we use the term fitness.
Yeah, good points. All right, so let's talk about, I guess, the background for both models that people will be hopefully familiar with. So we have, on one side, we have Mike Israetel in the RP model. Mike is very much working with advanced athletes for the most part, most of whom, to my knowledge, are enhanced, which means that they're dealing with a very different context to what Eric and Brian and myself are working with, mostly natural athletes who range from beginners, intermediates, and advanced as well. Mike also comes from a very sort of hypertrophy, bodybuilding, heavy background, whereas Eric and Brian have competed in powerlifting, so there is a little bit more of that bias towards load and intensity of load for Brian and Eric and myself as well. I've competed in powerlifting. So there's some important things to discuss. And I think when it comes to the models used, they're also in agreement in a lot of things. So I think both models agree that there is an optimal range of volume that is individual to every person who's training, and that training for the most part should occur within that optimal range. They just have different ways of getting there. So I think Mike's model is very much trying to find where that optimal range is. He works from minimum effective volume through to maximal recovery volume, and then working out average volumes over the course of a mesocycle and seeing where the average volume produces the best growth. Whereas Eric's is built upon the assumption that you kind of know where your adaptive range is, or you have some good idea of that, and you just start there, or you start a little bit below, have an introduction week, and then you get straight into it, and you hold that constant, only increasing or decreasing based on recovery and performance. And I think Mike's model has also evolved over the years. This wasn't the case in the letter to the editor, but in the discussions he had on the Revive Stronger podcast, he was very much in agreement that volume should be auto-regulated. And I think we all agree with that increasing volume arbitrarily is probably not a good idea. There should be some justification for that, whether it's using recovery and performance as proxies, or trying to drive non-functional overreaching and things like that. There needs to be some justification. But I guess there are some critiques of both models that have obviously been stated on the Revive Stronger podcast and in the letter to the editor. But one thing that I wanted to discuss was that I think didn't get enough attention in the Revive Stronger podcast, in the two-part series there, was the signal to noise ratio, and how when we train, as we mentioned, we have very complex systems that we're dealing with. So when we have a lot of moving parts, it can be really, really hard to figure out what's working, what's not, and what's causing the outcome to go in either direction. Get bigger, stay the same, get smaller. And I think the way that Mike was sort of detailing the RP model with a feet-forward approach of decreasing RIR, so getting closer to failure over a mesocycle, and ramping up volume, and I'm not even sure if he's auto-regulating volume, but moving from MEV to MRV, there's a lot of moving parts there. And I think in practice, for most lifters, that's going to increase the amount of noise that they're seeing, and it's going to be really, really hard to see what's working, whether it's the magnitude of tension that's driving the adaptations, or whether it's the exposure. And I think, from a logical perspective, it's a good idea to minimize noise. I think you want to have as little noise and try to control as many variables and manipulate one or two, or at least few, having an independent and dependent variable, much like, science operates, to, control things in a manner that allows you to assess and then adjust, as opposed to that feet forward approach. And I think, yes, this can work if you have, beginners who aren't training hard, as Mike mentioned, or people who have very, very stable sort of neurobiological backdrops where, they're sleeping the same amount every night. Their, activity levels aren't changing. Their stress levels don't change. And this is only really something we see with either high level athletes where their job is lifting, which is probably what the people that Mike works with, which is fair enough. Or people who just, have outliers, really. Like if you look on a bell curve, most people are going to have varying sleep. They're going to have, varying levels of stress, activity, all these sorts of things. And I really think that we should discuss this because, at least in my opinion, minimizing noise is hugely important. And I'm sure you agree, Martin. But what do you think of that? Anything that you want to add? Yeah, shoot, man.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I would also say that Mike argued that the feed forward approach would reduce the error margins associated with and just assessing your own RIR, which is obviously quite subjective. So Mike mentioned that if you started off with a specific number of reps and you use a specific load in week one, the next week you would try to keep the reps the same but add load, and theoretically that would get you closer, within closer proximity to failure, and increase the tension stimulus you are experiencing, and then thus reducing the error margin associated with RIR. Because what he's doing there is using objective increases in performance to kind of determine where the stimulus is heading. Whereas if you're not doing that, well then you are subject to this error margin that is undoubtedly evident across each and every person who kind of trains in the gym and tries to subjectively measure their own RIR. So I
But
feel
again,
like
let's just point out that both of those sort of ideas are based on assumptions,
yes,
right? It's like Mike's assuming everyone has a higher error margin for subjective ratings of effort,
yes.
whereas Eric is on the assumption when he was discussing this that people are getting it right or
Mm-hmm.
aren't as wrong as what people think.
Yes, and that's where the context comes into play. So if I'm working, for example, with a client who I am unsure about their current abilities to measure their RIR, especially when they're not training with me, on their own, then I may be more inclined to using that type of an approach where I increase their exposure to tension, because I know that maybe in those sets that they're completing, the magnitude just isn't there, or at least the true magnitude of tension they are experiencing isn't necessarily reflecting the RIR number that we see in the program. On the other hand, there definitely are individuals, and this is shown in research, uh, especially in trained individuals, where estimating RIR can actually be quite accurate at times, and thus that in itself reduces the error margin. So I guess what we can say here is that there is this training status um, uh, context, dependency, which needs to be taken into account. So I thought I'd just put that forth. So Jacob, where do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, no, I think that those assumptions are important to discuss. Um, and there are certain things we know about like volume and hypertrophy and things we don't know. And as we mentioned, like set progression for hypertrophy, we don't know a lot about. All we know is that there is this inverted U relationship. And I think extrapolating from research where they're comparing two groups using different volumes and then taking that as the best model for progression is a big leap. I think that's not necessarily something we can say with absolute certainty is going to be optimal. And I think what we do know is that a bigger muscle fiber relative to its size has a greater potential to produce force and can therefore lift more load for the same reps at the same RPE, RIR, or it can perform more reps with the same load at the same intensity, RPE and RIR, or it can lift the same load and same reps for a lower RIR, right? We know that. So a bigger muscle can lift more, should be able to perform better over time. And I think we have more certainty in that. And I think if we know that tension is this stimulus we need to produce growth, if we get that stimulus within the range where we think it's going to produce some robust hypertrophy, we should let adaptations increase our ability to do work over time, and that's a pretty reliable proxy for hypertrophy. Not necessarily in a mesocycle, but meso to meso, year to year on a certain lift in a certain rep range. We don't necessarily need to keep driving volume up for that outcome to occur, and that outcome is probably more reliable in demonstrating growth than just doing more volume. Adding more volume is just basically doing more work and getting more of that stimulus. As we said, there's a range for that, and sometimes doing more work and working harder isn't necessarily the best way to go about things. So I'm not sure what you have to say to that, but there are other things we know about volume. We know that adding sets, as I mentioned, increases the dose or the exposure to that stimulus. It needs to be done in consideration of intensity, so effort and load. If you're using very low loads at low RPEs, you're going to need to do more volume. If you're using all isolation exercises and irrespective of how close you are to failure, you could do more volume. If you're using more compound movements, you probably need to do less volume overall. We know that adding sets and volume will increase fatigue, right? It can increase fatigue because there's a very sort of strong relationship between total work and fatigue. And we also know that large relative increases in volume could potentially increase injury risk. And it will increase workout duration. So you're going to be training longer, and it will increase the amount of noise, in assessing outcomes if it's not a reactive approach. So yeah, that's what we do know, I guess, about volume progression. But there are a lot of things we don't know in terms of how effective it is in producing growth. But I guess based on what we've discussed previously, there's not a lot of reason to think that you need to be moving volume up and down, through this range of what will provide growth. For long-term hypertrophy, I think if we get it in that range and we keep it there, we're meeting those intensity thresholds, so training close enough to failure. We're going to grow, all else being equal. And if we use performance over longer periods as our proxy, we can then adjust volume and intensity accordingly. I don't think volume or intensity per se are what we should be looking at to measure outcomes. It's like we should be looking at performance, number one, but also visual changes too, scale weight, all those kind of things, right? So a lot of things that we need to look at. And hypertrophy is a very complex sort of training outcome. It isn't a training style. It's an outcome from training, right? And it's very forgiving, like outcome and adaptation. Like it really is. Like strength, you'll get found out if you haven't been getting your program right, and intensities are too high, volumes are off. Like you get found out real quick, whether or not the volume or intensity are off. It's like hypertrophy, as we've discussed, it's this range, and like you can be building muscle for a long time. You just need to be consistent with your approach. And I think that's something that I really want to drive home here, is that consistency is huge. Like you need to trial an approach for long periods of time to see whether it works for hypertrophy, to have any idea as to whether or not it works. If you're just trying Mike's approach for 8 to 12 weeks and then you go to Eric's, or you're chopping and changing, like you're not going to get any understanding of how you're responding to that, because hypertrophy is a very slow adaptation, but also very forgiving. And I think that gives us a lot of, which is cool, because that gives us a lot of room to sort of play, right? We can be creative. Like there is no hard and fast rules as to how we go about things. And I guess that's where we come in, because we don't really fit in Mike or Eric's camp. Like we sort of look at both and go, yeah, I can see your point here, I can see your point there, and I agree with that, disagree with that, and we sort of make up our own mind. And we have our own model, which is kind of like a hybrid of these two, which we can touch on. But I guess, yeah, Martin, you can speak to some of those points about what we know about volume and hypertrophy.
Yeah, I think that all made sense. Yeah, what I will say is I think it's important to give like all variables and even playing field, and I think that's what we do really well, because when you prioritize one, and that is the one variable that you are driving, as hard as possible, whether that be, it could be just exercise execution, it could be intensity, it could be volume. I think you are prone to facing limitations down the track. But and like you said, Jacob, hypertrophy programming is very forgiving. So there's a lot of things that can work, and you can get away with a lot. And I think that's why it is important that over time you look to refining your own strategies, and like I said earlier, overhauling the program based on one side or the other probably isn't a good idea. And in utilizing all these ideas and trying to integrate them into your own programming methodology is probably best, and sustaining that in the long run is crucial, because like you alluded to, Jacob, hypertrophy is this long-term adaptation, which is quite tricky to measure. Like you said, we have to use various measures, scale weight, visual progress, performance as well. And it takes time to see these changes manifest. So how do you know that the specific strategy is working if you aren't trialing it in the long term? And I would advise that people don't make those massive changes to their programs just to see if it works. Like make minor changes, see how things roll, make sure you are addressing or assessing the right measures of progress, and hopefully over time you see that hypertrophy manifest in all those measures that you are using. But I think you outlined all the things that we really know about volume. So
Yeah, and I guess we can kind of touch on, our model now, which is very much, I guess, smack bang in the middle of the two models that we've come to know, which are RP and then the Brian Miner, Eric Helms models. Um, so we usually, if we have data on somebody's training, we know their previous training volumes. We use that historical data to guide our volume selection, like how much volume they're doing for a given muscle group, amongst many other sort of data points that we infer from their training and the outcomes that they've got previously. And then from there, we'll usually start a mesocycle, with an intro week where we then progress volume, by generally, anywhere from like say 2 to 4 sets. It's all relative, but on average, it's probably like 2 to 4 sets from their intro week volumes. Say 20% increase, and we try to get to that adaptive range that we think will be the amount of work and the sets that will produce the best growth. We set RPE and RIR, usually pretty static, or sometimes it's a range. So for example, I program sometimes for some exercises, especially compound movements, like a range of 7 to 9, so an RDL. If somebody's doing 4 sets of RDLs and it's a 7 to 9, it's like I want the average RPE to be an 8. I'm happy if they sort of push up and some might have a lower effort set, depending on how they feel. Again, as long as they're within a few reps from failure, like they're still in that range of stimulus, and they can auto-regulate based on the day, right? And I generally advise them towards the end of a mesocycle to push closer towards that top end RPE, or if I'm programming, I'll narrow that RPE range down. It'll come up to an RPE 8 to 9 towards the back end of a mesocycle. For most movements, though, in that second week after the introduction week, I will usually set RPEs constant. So isolation exercises will be, at 1 rep from failure for the most part. Multi-joint machine exercises, usually an 8 to 9, depending on how fatiguing they are. And then most, big compound movements, anywhere from like a 7 to 9. And we keep it there. Now, where our model kind of differs is the back end of a mesocycle. So during the mesocycle, everything's reactive and auto-regulated. So, just set volume. If recovery is an issue, time constraints, whatever it might be, we'll increase volume up and down. Usually not by a lot, but some small change there. Otherwise, everything's pretty constant. But in those final few weeks, I'm not opposed to sprinkling in a few additional sets, especially for movements that are not very fatiguing and highly stimulating, such as isolation/single joint exercises, if that's a priority muscle group for that mesocycle. Just for good measure, because if the person has time for it, and they're not overly fatigued, it can't hurt. It can't hurt. They're going to get a little bit more stimulus, and it's timed at a point where they're going to deload and drop all that fatigue anyway. So we rinse and repeat that. We'll assess changes in performance on main lifts, as well as the isolation exercises. So, within a hypertrophy cycle, especially with higher volumes, performance isn't going to increase a hell of a lot, because you should be training under a bit of fatigue. But at the end of that mesocycle, you then compare to the previous mesocycle, and if performance is going up, that's a good sign that some hypertrophy is occurring, especially for isolation exercises. So if somebody's doing more reps on their isolation exercises, that's usually a really good sign they've got a bigger muscle, because there's very minimal skill involved. So neural adaptations don't contribute a hell of a lot. And they're also under fatigue from previous work in other exercises, which again is just evidence that the muscle can do more work, and usually that's because it's bigger. So that's usually how I go about things, and then I adjust from there. If somebody's experiencing growth at a rate that I think is appropriate for their level of advancement, I will keep things the same, rinse and repeat until something isn't working, or I think there are areas that could be significantly improved. If they're not gaining at the rate I think they should be, given their level of advancement and genetic potential, I will then look to, before I even change the program, I'll look to other variables, such as their technical execution, their nutrition, their sleep, their stress, their activity levels. Can I make a change to these things? Because usually I think I've got the program right. Like, I wouldn't give them a program that I thought was rubbish and could be improved later down the track. So if it's not working, I'll look to those things first. If we're ticking the boxes in all those areas, then I'll start to work through, the volume, intensity, and frequency, and say, okay, is this a recovery issue? Is this a stimulus issue? And then we work from there, because sometimes people can be doing too much, and they're just not getting the growth because they're getting maladaptation to the stimulus. So in those cases, we bring things down. If it's not enough stimulus, then usually we increase, and sometimes we decrease from muscle groups that are not a priority, and that frees up resources to go towards recovery and growth in those prioritized areas. So many methods, many roads to hypertrophy and program, but that's my approach. Marto, what's yours? Is pretty similar. I know we've had these discussions.
Yeah, I think I can just touch on a few points you raised. So you alluded to the differences in like the RPE or the RIR between certain exercises. And I think what we can kind of briefly discuss here, or I'll briefly touch on, is the effective reps concept. So I feel in some cases people can think of this effective reps model as a theory, but really it isn't a theory. Again, it's based on assumptions, like we spoke about earlier, and it's a concept that hypothesizes as we get closer to failure, we see this increase in tension and force within the muscles, and that's obviously what we're after for hypertrophy. But it is exercise dependent, and you mentioned, Jacob, with single joint exercises, taking them closer to failure is probably a good idea, because it is generally that one muscle which is dominating the movement, which is driving the movement. Whereas when we look at multi-joint exercises or big compound movements, which you refer to, let's say a squat or a bench press, there's obviously more than one muscle at work. And as we get closer to failure, we see this difference in tension distribution between the multi-joint exercise and the single joint exercises. So with the single joints, it's still that primary muscle which is putting in a lot of the work and experiencing a lot of the tension. Whereas there is research that shows that with exercises like the squat and the bench press, as you approach failure, you experience this change in the tension distribution. So, for example, the secondary muscles at work, with the bench press, you have the triceps, the anterior delts, they actually start kicking in quite significantly towards the end of this set, which hypothetically we're we're taking to failure. So with these exercises, it is probably in your best interest that you do leave, a few reps in the tank, and you are more conservative with the RPE or the RIR. And this is where using, so the way, Mike conveys his approach where, you just add sets week to week, you drop the RIR week to week till you get, to 0 to 1 from failure. I feel like some people would then take that and apply that to every single exercise, whereas I think we need to make it clear that there should be exercise dependent considerations here. So for example, to kind of, again, summarize that, with single joint exercises, setting the exposure and then driving the magnitude throughout the mesocycle is probably a good idea. Towards the end of the mesocycle, when you've probably capped the amount of stimulus you can actually achieve within like a set of bicep curls, like, if you're taking it to a 9, 10 RPE, there's not much more you can do to increase the stimulus there besides adding in an additional set and increasing the exposure like you outlined, Jacob. And this is very beneficial, especially when you are trying to specialize, a certain muscle group, and you do want to eke out more tension towards the end of a mesocycle as you're approaching a deload. On the other hand, with the multi-joint exercises, driving the magnitude to the same degree as you would for single joint exercises would probably come with some downsides. Like I mentioned, as you get very close to failure with those movements, you get an increase in tension in other muscle groups, and the primary muscles that you are actually trying to target with these exercises. Like, with a bench press, we're usually trying to target our chest, our pecs. With the squat, it's our quads. We start to see this decline in like tension, or at least not a decline, but just this plateau in tension in those primary muscles as we get close to
a
failure.
huge
So
increase in systemic fatigue.
yes, as well, and that is the other problem with driving the magnitude, primarily on these multi-joint exercises. We get this increase in fatigue, which with these compound movements tends to be quite systemic and can carry on to your subsequent sets throughout the rest of the workout. And what we know here is that neural fatigue, which does manifest due to training, really close to failure on pretty much every exercise, but I guess we could say it would probably be exacerbated if you have a barbell on your back, and you're doing a squat. That can then diminish your ability to activate, muscle fibers in subsequent sets, to activate fast twitch muscle fibers in subsequent sets with other exercises that are targeting that same muscle. So we just need to kind of understand that. And with multi-joint exercises, maybe it's best you maintain that RPE range, like Jacob mentioned, and avoid, driving it too close to failure, because we also have injury risk at that point as well, which for multi-joint exercises may be more pronounced than single joint exercises. So I guess those are some really important considerations which speak to, I guess, the diversity in like the set, rep, RIR, RPE prescriptions throughout a mesocycle, and that obviously has implications for how you progress these exercises as well. So just something to keep in mind there. The effective reps concept is dependent on exercises and training status as well. So yeah, what the research shows, like Jacob mentioned earlier, is that trained individuals can probably achieve high muscle fiber activation further from failure when compared to individuals who are untrained or even just novice individuals. So what that means is that, maybe with these untrained individuals, or not untrained, but, novice individuals, maybe you can get away with pushing them a little closer to failure across the board when compared to trained individuals. So just something to keep in mind there. There's no one size fits all. And the progression schemes that we see throughout a program and the aggressiveness of these progressions should be tailored to obviously the individual you're working with. Jacob also mentioned that there is a point in a hypertrophy phase where you will be training under fatigued conditions, and that is the nature of hypertrophy training. Towards the end of a mesocycle, increases in performance are generally hard to come by, but it's important to take that into account. And I mentioned this earlier. This mechanical tension stimulus isn't sensitive to performance per se. So,
that even means, sorry to cut in there, Martin, that even means that if you see a decrease in performance, that doesn't mean that you're not getting a stimulus.
That's what I was about to say. Yeah.
Sorry.
So exactly that. I took the words out of my mouth. So exactly that. So if we see this plateau in performance from week 5 to week 6 of the program, or we even see like a drop in reps, 1, 2 reps, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that we aren't within that optimal stimulus range, and our training isn't overloading, because remember, it is a range. And it is really important to understand that, because I've come across people who will essentially shit themselves if their performance has plateaued, or they've dropped a couple reps and they don't think they're building muscle, whereas that's not necessarily how it plays out. So yeah, something to keep in mind there towards the end of a mesocycle that is orientated towards hypertrophy. Fatigue will be high, and it is important. And this is also why it is important that you choose exercises in the first place that distribute the tension appropriately. So, to that target muscle. They have a full range of motion, like Jacob mentioned earlier. Stability of the exercise is high, and they also don't come with large degrees of fatigue. Now, there will be some exercises which will be more fatiguing than others, but it is important that, I guess, the outlook of the program, if you were to kind of look through each and every exercise, most of those exercises shouldn't be coming with a large degree of systemic fatigue, because that can then exacerbate this fatigue related issue towards the end of the program. So I guess that all comes down to the design of the program in the first place. That's going to influence your progression and how things unfold as the program goes on. So it's not just a matter of throwing in a bunch of random exercises into a program. Some exercises come with a larger capacity to experience stimulus in a certain muscle, and come with a lower amount of fatigue, and they're great exercises for hypertrophy. And then Jacob also mentioned how evaluating the program and using historical data is important, and I think that can really help when making volume adjustments from meso to meso. So instead of ramping up volume in exposure to tension in that one mesocycle, if you were to take the approach that Jacob outlined and evaluate the progress that you've actually made over the course of the mesocycle. And remember, progress here referring to these adaptations that we're after, so not necessarily the progression that you've seen on paper, but the progress. Have you actually built some muscle? Have you actually experienced hypertrophy based on the various measurements that you should be using? Well, then you can use that data to influence how your starting level of volume should look in the coming mesocycle. So, maybe you haven't experienced as much hypertrophy in your lower body, when compared to the upper body. Okay, so that's when you might add in a few additional sets to that starting level of volume, after the intro phase for the next mesocycle. And from meso to meso, you are continually, reevaluating your approach, refining it, and increasing, the amount of sets you're doing if need be. Sometimes that, might not be the case. Sometimes you'll be making, a great amount of progress on a certain amount of volume. And throughout the mesocycle, you're still within that optimal stimulus range, because you're driving the magnitude of tension. That's going to keep you there. You're adding a set here or there. And then over time, you're kind of driving up your exposure to the tension overall by adding in more sets. Your starting level of volume starts to kind of increase over time, and that allows you to keep pace with all these adaptations that you're acquiring from previous mesocycles. And I think that's quite a neat way of evaluating your programs and ensuring that meso to meso you are implementing things that are going to keep you within that range, which is going to change over time as you get bigger, you get stronger. And then the other one that I want to touch on is the specialization muscle groups. So, generally with hypertrophy, with beginner and intermediate individuals, you're probably going to have a program that aims to achieve whole body hypertrophy. These types of individuals probably don't require specialization per se, but advanced individuals, on the other hand, or even some intermediates may want to. It is quite common for these individuals to want to prioritize certain muscle groups, and that's when you can utilize the strategies that we outlined earlier, where you get towards the end of the mesocycle, and you add in an extra set or two. That's, like Jacob said earlier, that's probably not going to hurt, and you can then see or evaluate whether or not you've gotten the response you were after. Like, if you've added in an extra set to an exercise, but the repetitions that a client has achieved across the 3, 4, 5 sets decreased dramatically, well, clearly that additional set or two, whatever it has been, has probably been too much, and has probably come with a large degree of fatigue, and that has then greatly interfered with your performance. So I mentioned earlier, if we see a rep or two drop off, not a major issue, but if we're seeing these drastic reductions in repetitions from set to set, then the likelihood of there being a lot of lingering fatigue, which probably doesn't need to be there, is quite high, and I think would need to be addressed as well. But yeah, to kind of summarize that, I would say that certain muscle groups that you are aiming to specialize would then need to be treated somewhat differently to the other muscle groups when it comes to their progression schemes. So again, it's not a one size fits all across the board of exercises where each exercise experiences the same type of progression from week to week, which I have seen some people do in the past. So just something to keep in mind there.
I think you covered quite a lot there, and that'll be plenty for the listeners to unpack and get their heads around. And I think we're just over an hour, and I reckon we're going to call this one a day here, Marto. Potentially a part 2. There's a few other things that I think we can talk about, such as when less is more, and when reducing volume is probably a good idea, as well as some other things. But guys, thank you for tuning in. If you stayed with us for this long, credit to you. You're a gentleman and lady and a scholar. So thank you very much. Anything you want to add to finish, Marto?
Not really. I think that was a productive discussion. If you guys have any questions, based on the points that we brought up, then comment, and we'll be sure to address them down the track. But hopefully, the information that we put forth will help you make more sense of mesocycle progression in general, and hopefully you can integrate it into your own programs and see the progress that you want to see. So that's pretty much it.
Awesome. Thank you, Marto. Until next time.
No worries. Thank you.
See you guys.